In this video, I'm going to show you how to make what's called an anamorphic optical illusion. The special thing about this one though is that it's 3D printed, of course. So through this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to create some vector-based text, which we can shape into a disk pattern and then create our optical illusion. The way this optical illusion works is when you're looking directly at the disk, it just looks like nothing. But when you rotate the disk so you're looking at it at a sharp angle, you can see one set of words. And if you rotate it 45 degrees, you'll see another set of words. Okay, now the first thing we're going to have to do is create a vector artwork, and the program that I'm going to be using is Affinity Designer. If you're unaware of what this program is, it is basically a copy of Adobe Illustrator, but on a one-off payment. So unlike Adobe where you have to pay month by month, Affinity has a one-time payment and then you own it forever until at least a new version comes out. So if you're looking for a cheap alternative to the Adobe packages, I highly recommend looking at the Affinity suite, which includes Photo, Designer, and Publisher, which is the equivalent of the Adobe Photoshop, Illustrator, and InDesign. So what you're looking at here is Affinity Designer, and we're going to use this to create our vector artwork, which we can then save as an SVG and import into Fusion 360. If you have an alternative way of making an SVG and vector art, go ahead and do that. If you're following along with me, you're going to need at least Affinity Designer or somehow use Adobe Illustrator, but this tutorial won't cover Adobe products. Okay, let's get into it. So when you start Affinity, you're going to see a new document. We want to create let's just go 300 by 300 for our page size. The DPI we want quite high, so it's going to be 300 DPI. Color, we can go to transparent background, and then margins, we can not include margins, and then go to create. So we're going to have a new document created. What I like to do first is just create a circle, picking close to where I think the middle is, and then holding down Control and Shift, which is going to lock the size, but also center where it grows from. So we're going to bring it out to as close as we can to the edges, like that. And then we're just going to go back to our Move tool. We're going to align center and align middle. We also need to change the stroke. So we're going to put a 2 point for this, and we're going to change the fill to no fill. Okay, so this circle is just acting as kind of like a border. The next thing we want to do is create some text. And this is where I'm still experimenting with things, picking the right font that sort of works for this type of design. So if we pick the text tool, we can just draw a box, and we're going to call, say, in caps, and we're going to type out in capitals bamboo. And we're going to go back to our Move tool and again align center and align middle. And we're also going to align center for our text. So obviously this is way too big, but we can easily squish this down to size, and if you hold down Control, it's going to scale from the midpoint. And we don't want it right on the edge. We're probably going to want it about here. And we're also going to do the same, selecting the top point, holding down Control, and we're going to bring the top right up to the top here. We also need to change our font. Now, one I'm using here is Ostrich Sans. This is, if you search on Google, Ostrich Sans font, you should be able to find it. Again, I'm playing around with different fonts to find what works best for this actual design. This one I like to use because it's a thin one, and I find that thin text works better currently, but play around and see, you might find something that works better. If you do, let me know in the comments and I'll check it out. So we're going to have to readjust that again just because we've changed our font. We're going to also have to align middle and center again so it's in the right spot. So we kind of want to keep it to within our borderline, and we also want to stretch this out. We don't want it all the way to the edge. We want it probably about 70%, so something like that. And the next thing we need to do is add some curvature to this text. So if we go down to the warp tool and go to quad, and you want to click or double click where you think the center is, and you should get something like this. And now we can pick our points and start adjusting things. So I'm going to pick this point and this point, and we're going to move them down. If we hold down Shift, it's going to also bring them down in a straight line. Don't worry about this curvature in here at the moment because we can adjust that. I'm going to then let go of Shift, click this one, hold down Shift, click the other one, hold down Shift again and drag it up. And that should get us to where we want. If you do click off, you won't have control of those points anymore, so just go undo and you'll bring them back up. Now we need to adjust these control points. So you'll notice if I start to move this one around, we can get some nice curvature, and we are just aiming to try and have it so it's touching our border, and we can go around and do that for each side. We also got to be careful of the shape of our text. Obviously, if I'm trying to pull it in here, you can see this U is starting to lose its straightness. So we want to try and keep it straight. And this is where playing with different fonts might produce better results. In this case, we're just using this ostrich font. And again, we can do it on this side, trying to keep that text. See, we don't want to be doing this and bending our text too much. Get that curvature into it, but also make sure our text stays straight. And that will be our last one. And if you want to adjust anything further, we can, increase this a little bit more if we want to, but I don't think it's really going to be needed. Okay, so that's our first piece of text. We can go over here and hide it. And so that's our bamboo. And we're going to do the same thing again. This time it's going to be lab. Going to our move tool, center, justify, and align center, align middle. We need to again hold down control and stretch that out and bring it out to about 70%. We don't want it all the way because it's going to look weird when we squash it down, especially this L is going to get really, really small. So we want to try and keep some size to it. So that should be good. And we might just justify to double check. Again, go to our warp tool, quad, and we can start moving these points, holding down shift so we can pick two of them. And then, of course, that's what we need to do first. We need to pick our middle point, double click so it can produce our quads. Okay, and now we can pick those points, bring them down. So we can see this one's not touching. So different letters are going to end up in different locations, and it's going to be a matter of adjusting these so they fit. So it's not a perfect method, but it's just something for the community to play around with and see where it can be taken. That's actually turned out pretty well. I mean, it's a bit of a weird shape in here, but it's going to do. All right, now the next thing we need to do is we need to rotate this second one. So we can click on here, go out to the corner edge so we can see the rotation icon change. And then we're going to hold down shift so it locks into our angles and turn it 90 degrees. Now we can play with things and do one at 0 degrees and 45 and then another 45. And I think that's about all you can do. But in our case, we're just going to do 0 and 90. We can click off that. And if I unhide this other one, you can see what it's kind of looking like. The final thing we need to do so that the SVG works correctly, and we don't need this outside border anymore, so we can just turn that off. We need to convert both of these, so holding down shift, selecting both our texts, going over to layer, and then finding the convert to curves. Click on that and you should see that it's changed over here, and these are now curves. So when we export as an SVG, it's going to actually contain this data. All right, and then finally we can save this, and I'm just going to put it in my downloads. So just name it anything you want, like Bamboo Lab logo. And then we need to export it. So we go to File, Export, making sure our SVG is selected. We can go to SVG High Quality, 300 dpi. One thing we want to check is that Export Text as Curves is selected. Now, I think we've already converted it to curves, so it doesn't really matter, but I'm just going to tick that just in case. And that should be all we need to do. And we can export, find our location, and just call it, it's going to take on the same name. So Bamboo Lab logo SVG, save. And we are done. In the next part, we're going to go over to Fusion 360 and then start extruding to create our little disk. Okay, now into the second part. We're in Fusion 360. If you're not aware, this is a CAD package. It's really good for, beginner CAD artists. It's really powerful, but quite friendly at the same time. It's free to use. I'm not going to get into the real details. This isn't a tutorial on how to use Fusion, but jump in and use this to follow along with this particular tutorial anyway. What we're doing with Fusion today is super basic, so you're not going to need to know much if you aren't familiar with it. If you have Fusion 360, all you need to do from here is we just need to bring in our SVG and extrude it to create our little disk. The first thing we want to do though is create a kind of boundary zone, or the disk base itself. We do that by going to our sketch, and we can click on our ground plane. I'm going to create a circle from the center point and just drag it out, and then hit D on the keyboard for dimension. And we're just going to make this, let's make it 100 mil, and then finish sketch. We then hit E for extrude, and we need this at 1 millimeter. 1 millimeter is pretty much the minimum size you want to go. It has enough rigidity, but it's not super thin and flexible either. The next thing we want to do is create another sketch, and we're going to click on the top surface this time. And this is where we import our SVG. So we do that by going up to Insert and then Insert SVG. We can go to Insert from my computer, go to the location of where we saved your SVG file. In my case, I've just chucked it in downloads. So it's my BBL logo SVG, and go to Open. You may get something like this. So you see a little icon, but you don't see anything on screen. That's probably because it is way oversized. So if I zoom out, you can see it's way, way, way over here. Going back in, if we have a look at our icon, if we go to this little kind of like quadrant circle, hovering our mouse on that and clicking and dragging, we can actually resize our SVG. And you'll also notice it's probably upside down. In that case, we can click on this part of our icon and rotate it around. It should snap to 180 degrees. And then we want to click on the square to move its origin point. So try and center it on our disk. And what we're doing is we're sort of running our eyes around the perimeter of the circle and just checking if it's, you know, things are evenly spaced. We can see it's kind of like quite thin here, but then on this side it's a bit too thick. So it means it's not quite centered. And we can also increase the size a little, I think. So we can just scale that out just a little bit more, and then trying to recenter it a little bit. So I'm kind of keeping it selected and just running my eyes around and moving it back and forward to where I think the center is. And it doesn't have to be exact, just as close as we can. All right, so I think that's about right. It's good size. It's probably in the center. You want to do this the first time, because if you click OK, you can't really, as far as I know, you can't really go back and readjust and resize things easily. So if you do accidentally click OK, maybe just delete the sketch, go down here, right click, delete, and just do another sketch and insert the SVG. Otherwise, just try and do it right the first time, get the scale right, get the center in the rotation right. Once it is, click OK. Next we go to finish sketch, and we can go to our home view. Now we need to extrude this text. So again, E on the keyboard. We can go to a top view. It can make it a little easier to select things. And all we need to do is just go around and select all the pieces of text which is applicable to be extruded. So being careful, making sure we're picking all the parts that are selected. So we can see here, like this B will carry through here. So obviously it overlaps with the A and it's extruded. This part isn't, there's no text here. And we just go through like this. Now, what I like to do is, first thing we need to do is give it a height. I think 0.4 is enough. It's about 2 layers tall. The other thing we need to check is that the operation is set to new body. We don't want join or cut or intersect or anything like that. We want new body. This will make sure it is separate parts. So we have a base disk, and then we have our extruded text, and they are separate parts from each other. So making sure the operation is new body and then clicking OK, you should start seeing something like this. Now we need to add more to this, obviously. So all we need to do is go down to our feature, right click, and go to edit feature. And we can see our text again, and we can just continue clicking along. Now the reason why I do that, I'll explain while I'm clicking away here, is that sometimes you might accidentally click on something, and if you spend all this time clicking trying to get to the very last piece, and then you click on something you're not meant to, and then you're trying to unclick it and click it, and it just turns into a big mess, and you end up canceling and having to do the whole thing all over again. So I find if you just sort of like get a good starting point and then just editing the feature in, you know, small increments, you kind of save yourself, like kind of like a save point really. So what I like to do is just kind of get like a quarter of the way through and then clicking OK. And as this gets more parts extruded, it will become a little more process intensive. So things will slow down a little bit. but just give it time. It's a pretty stable program and you shouldn't crash if you just let it like run through and process what it needs to do. The other thing you should be aware of is if there are any really thin pieces, like this one's not too bad, but this one's getting pretty thin, and you need to make sure, is it a part that's being extruded or not? So obviously this A, or what letter is that? That's a B. It runs through here, and that is also part of the A. So both of these are extruded, all that's extruded, but also this is part of the A, the main section, mid section of the A. So basically all of that except these parts and these parts, this is extruded. So you kind of need to make sure, go through, think of what you are, clicking on, making sure it is being extruded correctly, and then just occasionally going to OK, like a save state, and continuing on. All right, I'm going to fast forward through the rest of this clicking, and then once I'm done, I will continue. All right, so it's pretty much done. I did notice as I zoomed out, these little sections, I don't think they are needing to be extruded actually. So if we click on that one again, and this little slice here, and it's going to completely depend on your text and your SVG. In my case, that stem, that midsection of the A cuts through, and then the B goes through there, and these aren't extruded. So lucky I picked up on that and fixed it up. All right, so that was the last piece. I can go to OK. And there we go. Now, if it's not visually clear, it may look something like this. And it's very hard to see your extrusions without sort of moving around. Just change your visual style. So if you go down to the display settings, go to visual style, shaded with visible edges only, which is also Control-6. And it should be much clearer on what is extruded and what isn't. Also, for our final step, just to make things a little pretty, we can click A on the keyboard for appearance and then type in black plastic without hitting enter. And you should see some appearances. If it has a little icon, you can download it first. They're all free, so download it and then it will become available. We can drag our black plastic material onto our text, and then we're going to need a green one of this as well. So we can duplicate it, then edit it, change it to a green, click done, and then drag that onto the base. So it should look like this. And now you can start to see the effect, and we can just close that as well. So here it kind of just looks like gibberish. You can kind of make out some lettering. If we are holding shift and dragging to rotate, you can see it says bamboo in this direction. And if we turn it this way, it says lab. So pretty cool little optical illusion. The final part is sending this over to Bamboo Studio so that we can print it out. Now we can do that by going to our file and export, and then saving it as a 3MF file, clicking on the three dots to save it to a location. But there is actually an easier way. If we go to file and then 3D print, we can select our format as 3MF. And here you want to go to custom and then browse for the Bamboo Studio exe file. That way you can make our selection, which is going to be our top level component, and clicking OK, and that's going to just export a 3MF and send it directly over to Bamboo Studio, as you can see is already loading up. Also make sure you save your work, so Control S just to save your work somewhere. If I go back to Fusion, Control S. Fusion uses a cloud saving system, so you'll need an account, etc., but you should know that already. And you can just set a name. You just say BBL logo effect, just something like that, whatever you want to name it to. Anyway, if we go back to our Bamboo Studio, when you're importing multiple objects, it's probably going to have this message saying multi-part object detected. Do you want to load it as a single file or multiple parts? You want to say yes to multiple parts. This is going to make it much easier to color things when they are separate objects rather than one object and trying to paint everything. The final thing we need to do in Bamboo Studio is just set our colors. Now I have two AMS units. That's why you're seeing almost 8. I just don't have one of the slots filled at the moment. If you have an AMS unit, you'll probably have, and you're going to need an AMS if you're going to be doing multicolor, but in this case we only need 2 colors, green and black, so you only need 1 AMS, which is going to hold 4 slots. What I want to show you, basically our settings are all going to be default. There's nothing special about this print. It's just 0.2, 0.24 with a 0.4 nozzle. That's fine. It's a fairly quick print. You're not going to notice much difference between different layer heights. So 0.2 is fine. Anything like infill, etc., it's too thin to really matter. So you don't really need to worry about anything. What we need to do though is we go over to our objects, and here we have our 2 parts. Now, a really cool tip, if you want to assign these colors to parts, what you can do is click on the part that you want assigned, and you can click multiple parts if you want, but next to each material in your AMS there is a number that corresponds to it. If you hit that number on the keyboard, it will just assign it to whatever you have selected. So in my case, I think this is the base piece, so I want that to be green, so I can just hit 2, and I was correct. And then the other one is the text, obviously, and I want that to be my black, which is 3. There we go. So that's a really easy way, especially if you have multiple. Instead of having to click on each one and selecting the color, you can just hold Shift or Control, select all the ones you want, hitting the number on the keyboard, and it will assign that color. It's the best thing I ever found out. There is one more thing. When you go to your global, there may be some very thin areas. If we just slice plate, it should sort of give you an idea of what it's going to print. But depending on how big some areas are, like these slices in here are quite small, and this one was very small, there is something called Arachne Mode, which you'll find in the quality tab down at wall generator. Instead of going classic, which is usually the default, you will want to go to Arachne. And what this is doing is that when something is really thin and it's too thin to actually print the geometry, the printer will just skip it. But when you have Arachne enabled, it will make sure that anything that is really thin, it will always print to the minimum size it can. So that way it's really good for anything with really thin features or details or text. If you have really small text, you can, or logos. Sometimes logos I find have really fine lines that don't always pick up and you lose a lot of geometry. If you set it to Arachne mode, it should print out. You kind of lose a bit of quality because you might not get those fine lines, but you'll know that it actually prints through where it should be. Since we're working with text, it probably is a good idea to have Arachne mode enabled for the wall generator. And then all we need to do is go to a slice plate. So this is going to take us 34 minutes. We could resize this a bit, honestly. I don't think it needs to be that big. So I'm just going to click on it and go to scale. Probably going to make this 80% the size that it needs, which brings it to around 80 mil. And just slice plate again. Okay, and we're down to about 25 minutes. So I'm going to print this now. Sending that off to print. Bed leveling I always have enabled. Flow dynamics I'm not going to use because I'm using a textured plate. Enable AMS obviously because I'm doing a multicolor print. Time lapse I'm not going to bother because it is such minimal amount of layers that it'll just be like a blip. So just having those two enabled and then sending to the printer. Next thing you'll see is what it looks like when it comes out of the printer. So I think the final effect is quite successful and it's not too hard to do. If you have found value in this tutorial, then please subscribe to the channel, like the video, and I'll catch you in the next one.